The alley ran narrow and black between the warehouses, slick with filth that never dried. The smell rose thick, rotting fish, human waste, the sweet decay of things left too long in shadow. Somewhere beneath the cobblestones, water moved through tunnels older than memory, and in that darkness 10,000 rats made their kingdom. Jack Blackwood knew the sound of them, the scritching that never stopped, the whisper of claws on stone that filled every silence in the rookeries of St. Giles. He stood motionless in the mouth of the passage, a canvas sack hanging from one shoulder, his coat black with the grease of his trade. In his left hand he held a wooden cage, and inside that cage something moved with terrible purpose. The gas lamp at the corner threw his shadow long across the wet stones. He had been a rat catcher for 17 years, since he was a boy of 9, and he knew things about London that gentlemen in Mayfair would never dream. He knew where the rats bred, he knew which cellars held the fattest ones, which sewers ran deepest, which taverns paid best for the sport. But tonight he carried something else in his bag, something that had made him £5 sterling from a man in a silk waistcoat who asked no questions and expected none in return. The wind shifted, carrying smoke from the tanneries, and Jack Blackwood stepped into the alley where the rats were waiting, and where history would remember him only as a shadow among shadows, if it remembered him at all. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Trade. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has settled around you now, and the world beyond your window has grown quiet and small. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour marks your clock, know that you are safe here in this moment, as we prepare to drift backward through time. Before you close your eyes, if you have not already, please do subscribe to this channel, so that we might continue these journeys together through history's shadowed corners. Now, let the present fade. Let us step into the fog of Victorian London, into alleyways where gas lamps barely pierce the gloom, and meet those souls who laboured in darkness, hunting the creatures that swarmed beneath the greatest city on earth. London in the year 1850 held 3 million people within its sprawling reach, from the marble halls of Westminster to the rotting tenements of Bethnal Green. It was the heart of an empire that stretched across oceans, a place of railways and industry, of gaslight and progress, where fortunes were made in shipping offices and counting houses. Yet beneath this veneer of civilization, beneath the cobblestones and the brick, in the cellars and tunnels and the forgotten spaces, another population thrived in numbers beyond counting. The rats of London bred in darkness, and they had done so for centuries, since the Roman walls first rose beside the Thames. They were as much a part of the city as the river itself, as permanent as stone, as inevitable as winter. And where rats gathered in such multitudes, there arose a class of men whose sole purpose was to hunt them, to trap them, to kill them by the thousand, and to profit from their endless proliferation. The rat-catcher was a figure known to every district from Mayfair to Shadwell, though his presence was rarely welcomed in daylight hours. He moved through the streets at dusk and dawn, often alone, carrying the implements of his trade in canvas sacks stained black with use. His coat bore the marks of his profession, tears from rat teeth, dark patches where blood had dried, the peculiar smell that clung to anyone who spent their hours in close proximity to vermin. Upon his shoulder he might carry a wooden cage, and at his heel would follow a small terrier, bred for the killing work, his jaws capable of snapping a rat's spine in one swift motion. Some catchers preferred ferrets, pale creatures with pink eyes that could be sent into holes and tunnels where no man could reach. Others relied upon traps, dozens of them, set each evening in the places where rats ran their ancient routes through the city's hidden arteries. The trade itself stretched back beyond memory, to the plague years when rats had been rightly feared as harbingers of death, though the mechanism of their pestilence was not yet understood. In the 14th century, when the Black Death had emptied entire villages, rat catchers had been among the few willing to enter infected houses, to handle the dead, to perform work that others fled from in terror. By the reign of the Tudors, rat catching had become a recognised occupation, with royal rat catchers appointed to maintain the palaces and official buildings. Henry VIII had employed such men, paying them in coin and lodging to keep the storerooms clear of vermin. Elizabeth had done likewise, understanding that grain must be protected, that the wealth of the kingdom rested in part upon preventing the destruction that rats wrought upon foodstuffs and goods. But by the Victorian age, the rat catcher had descended in status from palace retainer to creature of the slums. The great houses still employed them, certainly, calling them through the servants' entrance to deal with infestations in the wine cellars or scullery. The grain warehouses along the Thames paid regular wages to catchers who could keep the rat population manageable, though never truly defeated. The breweries, the tanneries, the slaughterhouses all required the services of men who understood rat behaviour, who could predict where they would nest, where they would feed, how they moved through the city in invisible rivers of fur and claw. Yet the catcher himself was regarded with a mixture of necessity and revulsion, a man who dealt in filth, who smelled of death, whose hands were scarred and whose face often bore the marks of bites that had festered and healed poorly. The true realm of the rat catcher lay in the rookeries, those dense warrens of humanity where the poorest of London's poor crowded into buildings that should have been condemned generations prior. In St. Giles, in Seven Dials, in the courts and alleys off Drury Lane, families lived 10 to a room in structures that leaned against one another for support, their foundations rotted, their walls running with damp. Here the rats moved as freely as the human residents, emerging at night to feed on whatever could be found, scraps thrown into the street, the contents of chamber pots, the bodies of infants who had died in the night and not yet been removed. A single room might harbour 50 rats in the walls and floorboards, and no amount of killing would permanently reduce their numbers, for they bred faster than any catcher could work. The men who performed this labour came largely from families who had done so for generations. A rat catcher's son became a rat catcher, learning the trade from his father as a blacksmith's son learned the forge. The knowledge was practical, earned through experience rather than written instruction, for few rat catchers could read or write. A boy of 8 or 9 would accompany his father on the rounds, learning to recognise the signs of rat presence, the distinctive smell of their urine, the grease marks along walls where their fur brushed repeatedly, the small piles of droppings that indicated regular paths. He would learn which poisons worked fastest, which traps were most reliable, how to handle a ferret without being bitten, how to train a terrier to kill without eating the rats it caught. He would learn the streets, the hidden places, the loose boards that gave access to cellars and coal holes. And he would learn the customers, the public houses that paid for rats alive, the households that paid for proof of rats killed, the men in certain neighbourhoods who paid for things beyond simple pest control. The economics of rat catching operated on multiple levels. The straightforward wage came from property owners who hired catchers by the day or week, paying perhaps 3 shillings for an evening's work, more if the infestation was severe. The catcher would arrive at dusk, set his traps or release his ferrets, and return at dawn to collect the dead. Proof of work was required. The rats themselves, counted and inspected to ensure the catcher had not brought rats from elsewhere to inflate his numbers. Some householders demanded the tails, which the catcher would sever with a knife and present in a bloodied bundle. Others required the entire body, which would be burned in the kitchen fire or thrown into the Thames. An experienced catcher might kill 200 rats in a single night in a heavily infested building, though such numbers were exceptional. More commonly, he would take 30 or 40, enough to justify his fee and demonstrate progress against an enemy that could never be fully vanquished. But the real profit in rat catching came not from killing rats, but from selling them alive. This was the trade that sustained many catchers, the secret economy that operated in the margins of respectable society. Rats caught alive and uninjured could be sold to the sporting taverns, to the rat pits where men gathered to wager on blood sport. A healthy rat might fetch 2p, sometimes 3p if it was large and aggressive. A catcher who could deliver 100 live rats to a pit on a Saturday evening might earn £1 or more, far exceeding what he could make from honest pest control. The demand was constant, for the rats died quickly in the pits, torn apart by terriers bred specifically for the sport, and fresh supplies were needed for every match. To catch rats alive required different skills than simply killing them. The catcher would use box traps with trap doors or nets stretched across tunnels in the sewers. Some catchers worked with their bare hands, reaching into nests and grabbing rats before they could flee or turn to fight. This was dangerous work, for a cornered rat would bite ferociously, and rat bites festered easily, leading to infections that could cost a man his hand or his life. The most skilled catchers wore leather gloves reinforced with wire, and they moved with a speed born of long practice, snatching rats by the scruff and dropping them into sacks before the creatures could twist around to sink their teeth into flesh. The rat catcher carried his implements with care, for they represented his livelihood, often his only possession of value. His traps were made of wooden wire, simple but effective, designed to catch without crushing. His cages were constructed to prevent escape, with small wire mesh and secure latches. His ferrets required feeding and maintenance, for a sick ferret was useless, and replacing one cost money he often did not have. His dog, if he kept one, was his companion as much as his tool, sleeping at his feet in whatever room he rented, following him through streets where other dogs would not venture. The bond between catcher and dog was often the only affection either knew, for rat catchers lived largely solitary lives, shunned by those who considered themselves respectable, dwelling in the same squalid neighbourhoods as those they served. Evening after evening, the catchers went about their work in the darkness that belonged to them and to the rats. They descended into cellars where the air hung thick with methane from decaying matter, where a single flame might ignite an explosion. They crawled through spaces beneath buildings where the clearance measured less than 2 feet, where rats nested in such density that the ground seemed to move. They waded through water in the ancient Fleet River sewer, where rats swam in numbers that defied belief, their bodies creating currents in the filthy stream. And they did this work without complaint, without recognition, for it was the work their fathers had done, and their fathers before them, stretching back through generations of London's hidden history. The city above barely acknowledged their existence except when rats became too numerous to ignore, when they emerged in daylight hours, when they were found in shops or homes in the better districts. Then the rat catchers would be summoned, and then they would arrive like grim physicians to treat a condition that could be managed but never cured. They would perform their service, collect their fee, and disappear back into the rookeries, back into the tunnels and alleys where they belonged, where they would remain until called again, and the rats would continue breeding in the dark, and the catchers would continue hunting them in a cycle as old as London itself, as permanent as the stones of the tower, as endless as the Thames flowing toward the sea. The forgotten trade continued night after night, year after year, while the empire expanded and railways were built and the Crystal Palace rose in Hyde Park to showcase the achievements of the modern age. But beneath it all, in the spaces nobody wanted to see, men pursued rats through darkness, and the ancient dance of hunter and hunted went on unchanged, as it had for centuries, as it would for decades yet to come. Chapter 2. The Rookeries. The district of St. Giles sat like a wound in the heart of London, a sprawl of crumbling buildings and narrow passages where sunlight penetrated only at midday, and then only as thin shafts that illuminated the filth, rather than dispelling it. The streets bore names that mocked their condition: Great White Lion Street, George Street, Carrier Street. But no greatness existed here. No triumph, only the slow grinding poverty that consumed generations without mercy. 7,000 souls lived compressed into these few acres, packed into rooms that had once been single dwellings but now housed entire families in each partitioned space. The buildings leaned against one another, their timbers rotted, their plaster fallen away to reveal bare lath beneath. Rain found every crack and crevice, running down interior walls, pooling in corners where it never dried, creating the perpetual dampness that bred disease and despair in equal measure. Here the rat catchers found their most reliable employment, though the term employment suggested a formality that did not exist in the rookeries. No contracts were signed, no regular wages paid. Instead, the catcher operated on an informal basis, known to the residents, called upon when circumstances became desperate. A family might pool their pennies to hire him when rats had eaten through their meagre food stores, when children woke with bites on their faces, when the creatures grew bold enough to emerge in daylight. The catcher would come, would work his dark trade, and would accept whatever payment could be offered. Coins if available, sometimes food, sometimes gin, sometimes nothing at all, with the understanding that the debt would be remembered and perhaps repaid when fortune improved, though fortune rarely improved in St. Giles. Thomas Archer had been born in these streets in the year 1823, delivered in a room on the third floor of a building in George Court, where his mother had died 3 days later from childbed fever. His father had worked as a catcher, as had his grandfather before him, and Thomas had learned the trade before he could properly read or write. His earliest memory was of rats, of their smell and sound, of the way they moved in the walls of his childhood home. By age 7, he was accompanying his father on the rounds, carrying the smaller traps, learning to move quietly, to observe, to understand the patterns of rat behaviour that governed their world. His father had taught him that rats were not stupid creatures, that they learned and remembered, that they would avoid traps where other rats had been caught, that they followed invisible paths through the rookery that had been established over generations of rat history. The rookery itself was a vertical maze, a 3-dimensional labyrinth where passages connected at odd angles, where stairs led nowhere, where rooms had been subdivided and subdivided again until the original structure was impossible to discern. Buildings that appeared separate from the street were connected by tunnels and crawlways known only to residents and rats. A person could enter on Carrier Street and emerge 10 minutes later on Church Lane, having passed through a dozen different buildings without ever seeing the sky. For rats, these passages were highways, protected routes, where they could move unmolested from one food source to another. The catchers learned these routes as thoroughly as the rats themselves, understanding that to control rat movement, one must think as a rat thinks, must see the city as they saw it, not as streets and buildings, but as a network of shelter, food and safety. Whitechapel lay to the east, a district whose name would become infamous decades later, but which in the 1850s was already a byword for squalor and vice. The streets around Dorset Street and Flower and Dean Street contained lodging houses where beds could be rented for 4p a night, where men and women slept in rows in rooms that held 50 or more, where the heat of bodies kept the cold at bay but also created conditions ideal for vermin. The rats here were different from those in St. Giles, Thomas had learned. They were bolder, more aggressive, perhaps because they lived among people more desperate, who had less strength to fight them. In the lodging houses, rats would climb onto sleeping bodies, seeking warmth or investigating whether the person still lived. Children particularly suffered, for they slept deeper and moved less, and a rat would gnaw at an infant's finger or toe, drawn by some instinct toward the soft flesh of the very young. The catcher moved through Whitechapel in the hours before dawn, when the lodging houses emptied their residents into the street to make way for cleaning, though cleaning was a generous term for the cursory sweeping that took place. He would enter through the back, negotiate with the keeper, and set his traps in the cellars and ground floor rooms where rats nested in greatest concentration. The lodging house rats were easier to catch than those in private dwellings, for they had grown accustomed to human presence, had lost some of the wariness that made their country cousins more difficult prey. Thomas could fill his sacks quickly in such places, often taking 50 or 60 rats in a single visit, though the keeper would complain about the noise of the traps, would protest that the residents were disturbed, would inevitably attempt to reduce the agreed fee by claiming the infestation had been exaggerated. Southwark, across the river, presented different challenges. The old borough had been London's gateway from the south since Roman times, and its foundations were ancient, its cellars deep, its sewers a warren that connected to tunnels whose origins no living person could state with certainty. Here rats grew larger than elsewhere, feeding on offal from the tanneries and slaughterhouses that lined the Thames. Thomas had seen rats in Southwark as large as cats, their bodies thick with muscle, their teeth yellowed and long. Such rats did not flee from terriers, but would turn and fight. And more than one dog had been killed in these encounters, its throat torn open by a rat that refused to die easily. The catchers who worked Southwark carried clubs, heavy lengths of wood that could crush a skull with one blow. For there were times when traps and dogs were insufficient, when a man must kill directly or be injured himself. The smell of the rookeries was a thing that could not be washed away, a compound of human waste and rotting food, of damp plaster and coal smoke, of death in its various forms. Bodies were not always discovered quickly in these districts. An elderly person living alone might die and lie undiscovered for days or weeks, and rats would find the body long before any human did. The catchers encountered such scenes regularly, entering rooms where the smell announced what waited within, where rats had already begun their feast. There was no ceremony in such discoveries, no particular horror, for the catchers had seen worse and would see worse again. They would report the death to the parish beadle if they felt moved to do so, though often they simply closed the door and continued their work, for the dead were beyond help, and the living required attention. Children in the rookeries learned rat awareness as naturally as they learned to walk. A child of 3 knew to keep their fingers out of holes in walls, knew not to leave food unattended even for a moment, knew the sound that meant rats were approaching rather than departing. Many children bore scars from rat bites, thin white lines on hands and feet where teeth had punctured skin. Some lost fingers to infection, the flesh turning black and rotting, until a barber surgeon performed amputation with a knife that had probably not been cleaned since its last use. Such injuries were common enough to attract little notice, simply another hardship of life in the rookeries, no more remarkable than hunger or cold or the cough that killed so many before they reached their 10th year. The rookeries expanded and contracted like living things, responding to economic forces that their residents barely understood. When work was plentiful at the docks, the lodging houses filled, and new buildings were thrown up with no thought to sanitation or safety. When trade declined, the population thinned as people moved on in search of employment, leaving buildings to stand empty until the next influx. But the rats remained constant, their population independent of human fortune, breeding according to their own cycles, limited only by available food and shelter, both of which existed in abundance regardless of how many people occupied the district. Thomas Archer knew every court and alley in a dozen rookeries, knew which buildings were most heavily infested, which landlords would pay fair rates, which ones would dispute the count or claim the rats were not as numerous as reported. He knew the pubs where he could sell live rats, knew which evenings the pits were open, knew how to keep rats alive and healthy until delivery. His father had taught him to feed captive rats on bread soaked in milk, to keep them in darkness where they would remain calm, to handle them firmly but without cruelty, for an injured rat was worth nothing. The sporting men wanted rats that would fight, that would give the dogs a proper match, not creatures too weak or damaged to provide entertainment. The catchers themselves lived in the rookeries, for they could afford no better lodging, and perhaps would not have been welcome elsewhere. Thomas rented a room on the ground floor of a building in Monmouth Street, a single space perhaps 10 feet square, with a window that had long since lost its glass and was covered with boards. He kept his traps here, his cages, his sacks and tools. His ferret lived in a box under the bed, and his terrier, a rough-coated creature named Jack, slept across the threshold. The room cost him 2 shillings a week, paid every Monday to a landlord he had never met, the money collected by an agent who came round with threats about what would happen if payment was late. Thomas paid on time, always, for he knew that eviction was swift in the rookeries, and a new tenant would occupy his room within hours of his departure. Evening descended over St. Giles with a quality of darkness that seemed thicker than elsewhere in London, as if the shadow of the buildings retained some substance even after the sun had set. Gas lamps existed on the main thoroughfares, but the courts and alleys remained unlit, their darkness absolute except when moon or stars penetrated the gap between buildings. This was the catcher's time, when honest folk retreated indoors and the rats emerged to own the streets. Thomas would take up his bag and his stick, would whistle for Jack, would step out into the night that belonged to him and to the creatures he hunted. He would walk the familiar routes, setting traps in locations he had used 100 times, checking previous sets, collecting the dead and the captured, moving through darkness with the confidence of long practice. Other catchers worked the same districts, and there was an understanding among them, an unspoken division of territory that prevented conflict. Young men sometimes challenged these arrangements, attempting to poach another catcher's established routes, but such challenges rarely succeeded. The residents knew their catchers, trusted them to the extent that trust existed in such places, and would not readily accept a stranger. The violence between catchers was not unknown, though it was rare, for they understood they shared common interest in maintaining the trade. A catcher found dead in an alley might bring police attention to the rookeries based, and police attention was unwelcome to everyone involved in the various illegal activities that sustained the district's economy. The rookeries bred rats and misery in equal measure, and both were harvested by those who had learned to profit from suffering. The landlords collected rents from tenants who could barely afford bread. The gin sellers poured poison into glasses for pennies. The thieves and prostitutes worked their trades under the protection of criminal networks that paid for the privilege of operating without interference. And the rat catchers moved through it all, neither respected nor entirely despised, necessary in the way that gravediggers were necessary, performing labour that someone must do, though no one wished to think too carefully about the details. The rookeries would stand for decades more, would resist every effort at reform, would survive until finally demolished by councils who could no longer tolerate the shame of such places existing in the heart of empire. But in 1850, they stood eternal, unchanging, a dark mirror to the prosperity proclaimed in parliamentary speeches, and the rats within their walls bred on, and the catchers continued their work night after night, in the shadows where history forgot to look. Chapter 3. The Tools of the Trade. The workshop occupied a cellar room beneath a grocer's shop on Drury Lane, accessed by stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Here William Hatch crafted the implements that rat catchers carried into battle against their ancient enemy. The room smelled of wood shavings and metal, and the particular odour of glue rendered from animal bones, and its walls were lined with traps in various stages of completion. Hatch had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father before him, and the basic design of a rat trap had changed remarkably little over the span of those generations. Wood, wire, and spring, these elements combined in configurations that exploited rat behaviour, that turned the creature's own instincts toward its doom. The simplest trap was nothing more than a box with a trap door, weighted with a stone so that when the rat entered to reach the bait, its weight triggered a release mechanism that dropped the door closed behind it. Such traps required no spring, no complex mechanics, and could be constructed by anyone with basic carpentry skills. The catcher would bait the box with bread soaked in fish oil or a piece of bacon rind, would set it in a location where rats were known to travel, and would return hours later to collect whatever had been caught. These traps caught rats alive and unharmed, making them valuable for catchers who sold to the sporting pits, but they were bulky and could hold only one rat at a time, limiting their efficiency. More sophisticated was the snap trap, which employed a spring-loaded bar that struck the rat across the neck or back when triggered. Hatch constructed these traps with careful attention to the tension of the spring, which must be strong enough to kill instantly, but not so strong that it would break when released. The trigger mechanism was a small platform on which the bait rested, balanced so delicately that even the light weight of a rat would disturb it. When the rat stepped onto the platform to investigate the bait, the catch released, and the bar snapped down with force sufficient to break bone. A rat caught in such a trap died within seconds, though not always silently, and catchers learned to distinguish the particular sound of a trap being triggered from the many other noises of the night. The wire cage trap represented greater complexity, a cylinder of wire mesh, perhaps 18 inches long and 6 inches in diameter, with trapdoors at each end. The design exploited rat behaviour in a clever manner. Bait was placed in the centre of the cylinder, visible from either end. A rat entering from one side would pass through a hinged door that swung inward easily but could not be pushed outward. Upon reaching the bait, the rat would find itself trapped, for the door through which it entered had swung closed behind it. Additional rats could enter through the same door or the door at the opposite end, and a single cage might contain a dozen rats by morning. Hatch charged 15 shillings for such a trap, a significant sum, but catchers who could afford the investment found them valuable, for they maximised catch with minimum effort. Poison represented a different approach entirely, requiring no traps or mechanisms, only knowledge of where to place it and how to prepare it for maximum effectiveness. The most common poison was arsenic, available from chemists and colour merchants, sold as a white powder that could be mixed with flour and lard to create a paste. The catcher would spread this paste on pieces of bread or mix it into rendered fat which rats found irresistible. Death from arsenic was neither quick nor painless. The poisoned rat would begin to suffer within hours, its stomach cramping, its breath growing laboured, foam appearing at its mouth. It might take a full day to die, and during that time it would retreat to its nest, where it would die among its companions. The advantage of poison was that it required no collection of bodies, no disposal of carcasses. The rats simply died in hidden places and were forgotten. The disadvantage was that poison might be consumed by cats or dogs, by the chickens that some residents kept in the rookeries, even by children who found the baited bread and ate it unknowing. Strychnine acted faster than arsenic, causing violent convulsions within 30 minutes of consumption. A rat poisoned with strychnine would arch its back, its muscles contracting with such force that bones sometimes broke from the tension. It would die in agony, though the death was mercifully brief compared to arsenic. Catchers used strychnine when speed was required, when a building needed to be cleared of rats before an event or inspection. The poison was more expensive than arsenic and more dangerous to handle, for it could be absorbed through skin, and a careless catcher might poison himself. Hatch kept strychnine locked in a wooden box marked with a skull, and he sold it only to catchers he knew well, for he understood that such substances could be put to purposes beyond killing rats. Phosphorus paste provided a third option, glowing faintly in darkness, making it easy for catchers to track where they had placed it. The paste was made by mixing white phosphorus with flour and suet, creating a substance that rats would consume readily. Phosphorus destroyed the liver and kidneys, causing death within a day or two. The dying rats would seek water, and catchers often found them clustered near puddles or rain barrels, their bodies bloated, their eyes dull. Phosphorus paste had the additional advantage of making dead rats unpalatable to other creatures, reducing the risk of secondary poisoning. However, phosphorus was highly flammable, and more than one catcher had suffered burns when paste ignited unexpectedly, for white phosphorus could combust if exposed to air at warm temperatures. The ferret was a living tool, bred and trained for the specific purpose of driving rats from places where traps could not reach. A ferret measured perhaps 18 inches from nose to tail, with a flexible body capable of squeezing through openings no wider than 2 inches. Its natural aggression toward rats made it ideal for the work, though ferrets would kill and eat rats if not supervised, reducing the profit from catching them alive. A trained ferret would enter a hole on command, would pursue rats through tunnels and passages, driving them toward exits where the catcher waited with nets or clubs. The ferret itself was not immune to injury. Rats would fight when cornered, and a large rat could inflict serious damage on a ferret, biting through skin and muscle to reach vital organs. Catchers who relied on ferrets kept multiple animals, knowing that injuries and death were inevitable in the trade. Training a ferret required patience and an understanding of the creature's nature. A young ferret taken from its mother at 8 weeks would be introduced gradually to dead rats, learning their scent, becoming accustomed to their presence. As the ferret matured, it would be allowed to kill rats under controlled circumstances, developing the hunting instinct that made it valuable. A ferret that killed too readily was less useful than one that would drive rats without stopping to feed. and achieving this balance required skill that separated experienced catchers from amateurs. The ferret must be hungry enough to remain interested in rats, but not so hungry that it would stop to eat the first one it caught. The terrier represented the most common tool in the catcher's arsenal, a dog bred specifically for killing rats, with jaws powerful enough to crush skulls and a temperament that combined courage with aggression. The ideal rat terrier stood perhaps 12 inches at the shoulder, with rough coat, muscular build, and eyes that never wavered from their target. Such dogs cost anywhere from 5 shillings to £1, depending on breeding and proven ability, and a catcher might spend months' earnings to acquire a good one. The dog would accompany its master everywhere, sleeping at his feet, eating from his plate, sharing the hardships of the trade. The bond between catcher and dog was often the closest relationship either experienced, for the work they performed together required trust and understanding that few human partnerships achieved. Training a rat terrier began in puppyhood, with exposure to dead rats, then weakened or injured rats that the puppy could kill easily, building confidence and reinforcing the hunting instinct. As the dog matured, it would face increasingly difficult challenges: rats in groups, large rats capable of fighting back, situations where the dog must kill quickly without hesitation. A fully trained terrier could kill a rat in one shake, breaking its neck or crushing its skull, then immediately move to the next target. The best dogs could clear a room of 20 rats in under a minute, moving with mechanical efficiency, killing without emotion, stopping only when no living rats remained. The catcher's clothing itself was specialized, designed to protect against bites and to allow freedom of movement in cramped spaces. Heavy canvas trousers resisted rat teeth better than wool or cotton, though determined rats could chew through anything given sufficient time. The coat was typically leather or heavily waxed canvas, with sleeves that could be rolled down to cover the wrists. Boots rose to mid-calf, preventing rats from crawling up the legs, a hazard in spaces where rats were numerous enough to swarm over a person. Gloves varied by preference. Some catchers wore leather gloves reinforced with wire, while others preferred bare hands, claiming they could feel what they were doing better without the impediment of leather. Those who worked bare-handed inevitably bore scars, thin white lines across palms and fingers where rat teeth had found flesh. The sack in which caught rats were placed required careful consideration. Canvas was strong enough to contain rats, but porous enough to allow air circulation, preventing suffocation during transport. The sack must be secured tightly, for rats could chew through loose stitching given opportunity. Some catchers tied the neck of the sack with wire rather than rope, believing it more secure. Others used double bags, placing one inside another for additional safety. A sack full of live rats was a dangerous thing, requiring constant attention, for the rats would climb over one another seeking escape, would gnaw at the fabric, would eventually find weakness if given sufficient time. Catchers transporting rats to the sporting pits moved quickly, knowing that delay increased risk. The club or stick completed the catcher's basic equipment, a length of hardwood perhaps 2 feet long weighted at one end with lead or iron. This served multiple purposes. It could be used to stun rats before capture, to dispatch injured rats that a trap had caught but not killed, to defend against aggressive rats that turned to attack rather than flee. Some catchers carved notches into their sticks, 1 notch for each 100 rats killed, though this practice was more superstition than record-keeping. The stick became an extension of the catcher's arm, carried everywhere, worn smooth by years of use until it fit the hand perfectly. Hatch's workshop supplied catchers throughout London, and he knew the requirements of the trade better than anyone. He understood that a trap must be reliable, that it must work identically the 100th time as the first, that a catcher's livelihood depended on tools that performed without failure. He tested every trap before sale, setting it repeatedly, adjusting springs and catches until satisfied with its operation. His traps bore his mark, a small H burned into the wood, and catchers who carried hatch traps were known to be serious about their work. The tools defined the trade, and the trade defined the men who practiced it, and together they formed a system that had evolved over centuries, adapting to changes in the city while maintaining fundamental approaches that worked because they understood the nature of the enemy they faced. Chapter 4: The Rat Pits. The Crown and Anchor stood on the corner of Ludgate Hill and Old Bailey, a public house of no particular distinction from the street, its exterior as unremarkable as any of the 100 other establishments that served the working men of London. The sign above the door showed faded paint, the Crown barely visible, the Anchor reduced to abstract shapes. That might have been anything. During daylight hours, the Crown and Anchor operated as an ordinary pub, serving ale and gin to labourers and clerks, its main room filled with the conversation and tobacco smoke common to such places. But on certain evenings, after the respectable trade had gone home to their suppers, the Crown and Anchor transformed into something else entirely, something that drew men from across the city to participate in a sport as old as London itself. The pit itself occupied the cellar, accessed by narrow stairs that descended from a door behind the bar. The room measured perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling so low that tall men must duck their heads. Lamps hung from hooks in the beams, casting flickering light that left the corners in shadow. The floor had been dug out to create a depression in the centre, perhaps 6 feet in diameter and 2 feet deep, with wooden walls that prevented anything inside from escaping. Benches arranged in tiers surrounded this pit, rising toward the walls, allowing perhaps 50 men to observe the proceedings in relative comfort. Though comfort was a generous term for wooden planks worn smooth by years of use. The air in the cellar was thick with smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies, of spilled beer, and the particular odour of fear that rats produced when confined. James Wakefield owned the Crown and Anchor, having inherited it from his father in 1842, along with the rat pit and the clientele that came with it. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, heavy-set, with hands scarred from his youth when he had worked as a slaughterhouse man in Smithfield. He understood the sporting inclinations of London's working men, understood that they would wager on anything. Dice, cards, cockfights, dogfights, and rat-killing. The rat pit provided entertainment that was legal enough to avoid serious police attention, while being brutal enough to satisfy the appetites of men whose lives offered little in the way of spectacle. Wakefield charged no admission, making his profit from the ale and gin sold to spectators, and from the side wagers he facilitated, taking a percentage of each bet placed through his establishment. The rats came from catchers who delivered them by the hundred on evenings when matches were scheduled. Thomas Archer brought his catch to the Crown and Anchor every Saturday, arriving at dusk with sacks that writhed and squeaked with the movement of creatures inside. Wakefield would count them personally, inspecting each rat to ensure it was healthy and strong, rejecting any that appeared sick or injured. The price paid varied by size and apparent fighting spirit. Small rats fetched a penny each. Large aggressive rats might command threepence. A catcher could earn £1 or more from a single delivery, more than he might make in a week of ordinary pest control work. The rats would be transferred to holding cages in the cellar, given water but not food, for hungry rats fought harder and fighting ability was what the sport demanded. The dogs that fought in the pit were terriers, bred and trained specifically for this purpose, animals that had never known any existence beyond killing rats. A fighting terrier might weigh 12 to 15 pounds, with powerful jaws, quick reflexes, and a temperament that combined courage with absolute focus. The best dogs were worth substantial sums. A proven killer might sell for £5 or more, and their owners treated them with a care that exceeded what they showed their own families. The dogs were fed on raw meat, exercised daily, kept lean and hard. Before a match, the dog would be washed and dried, its coat groomed, its nails trimmed short to prevent injury to itself. The owner would carry the dog into the pit room wrapped in a blanket, protecting it from distraction until the moment of combat arrived. The matches followed established patterns, though the specific rules varied by venue. At the Crown and Anchor, the standard match involved 50 rats placed in the pit with a single dog, and wagers were placed on how quickly the dog could kill them all. A timekeeper stood with a pocket watch, marking the moment when the dog was released and the moment when the last rat died. The fastest dogs could clear 50 rats in under 5 minutes, though such times were exceptional and commanded fierce betting interest. More commonly, a good dog required 7 to 10 minutes, and the variation in performance created the uncertainty that made wagering appealing. The rats were dumped into the pit from a sack, tumbling over one another in panic, immediately seeking the walls, climbing over each other in frantic attempts to escape. The spectators would begin shouting even before the dog appeared, encouraging the rats in mockery, cursing them, laughing at their terror. The noise in the cellar grew until conversation became impossible. 50 men yelling at once, their voices echoing from the low ceiling, creating a wall of sound that added to the chaos. Then the dog would be placed in the pit, and silence would fall for just a moment, anticipation holding its breath, before the timekeeper shouted the signal and the killing began. A trained rat dog moved with mechanical efficiency, grabbing rats one after another, shaking them with a motion that snapped their spines, dropping the dead and immediately seizing the next target. The best dogs worked methodically, ignoring rats that fled to corner and focusing on those in reach, killing in sequence without wasted motion. Blood appeared quickly, spattering the walls of the pit, marking the dog's muzzle and chest. The rats fought back when cornered, biting at the dog's face and legs, but a good dog seemed not to notice injuries, continuing to kill until no living rats remained. Some rats died from broken necks, their heads twisted at unnatural angles. Others were crushed, their ribs broken by the force of the dog's jaws. A few might survive the initial shake and mid-hear, would lie stunned, only to be grabbed again and shaken harder. The spectators maintained constant noise throughout the match, shouting encouragement to the dog, cursing when it paused or missed a target, roaring approval when it made a particularly impressive kill. Men who had wagered large sums grew increasingly animated as time passed, their fortunes rising or falling based on seconds. The timekeeper called out at intervals, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3, and the betting intensified, for side wagers could be placed even during the match on whether the dog would finish within a predicted time. Wakefield moved through the crowd, noting bets in a small book, collecting money, paying out winners, his percentage assured regardless of outcome. The end came when the last rat died, and the timekeeper shouted the final number. The dog's owner would jump into the pit, grabbing his animal before it could begin eating the dead, for a dog that learned to stop and feed during a match lost the focus that made it valuable. The dog would be wrapped in the blanket again, carried upstairs, given water, examined for injuries. Minor bites and scratches were common, but serious injuries could end a dog's career, and owners watched anxiously for signs of damage that would prevent future matches. The pit itself would be cleared of dead rats, their bodies shoveled into barrels to be sold the next morning to farmers who used them for pig feed. The final economic use extracted from creatures that had been bought, fought, and discarded within the span of hours. Some matches involved competition between dogs, with 2 terriers placed in the pit simultaneously to see which could kill more rats within a set time. These matches generated fierce rivalries between owners and spectacular betting. The dogs would work side by side, sometimes interfering with each other, occasionally snapping at one another in the heat of killing. The rats in such matches had no chance whatever, caught between 2 efficient killers, their deaths coming even faster than in single-dog matches. 50 rats might be dead within 3 minutes when 2 dogs worked in tandem, the pit floor becoming slick with blood, the walls spattered red up to the height a man could reach. Special matches were arranged on occasion, pitting legendary dogs against extraordinary numbers. A dog named Billy, owned by a man from Islington, had achieved fame throughout London for killing 100 rats in 5 minutes and 30 seconds, a record that stood for years and was discussed in sporting houses across the city. Men who had witnessed Billy's performance spoke of it with reverence, describing the dog's speed and precision, the way it never paused, never hesitated, moving through the rats like death itself given form. Such performances drew crowds that filled the cellar beyond capacity, men standing pressed against walls, unable to see but unwilling to miss the event. The rat pit existed in a moral space that Victorian society preferred not to examine too closely. The sport was not illegal, for Parliament had never bothered to legislate against it. Yet it was not respectable, not something discussed in polite company or mentioned in newspapers. The men who attended the pits were labourers and tradesmen, costume mongers and market porters, men who worked with their hands and who saw nothing wrong in watching dogs kill rats for entertainment. They argued, when challenged, that rats were vermin, that killing them served a public good, that the sport was no more cruel than cockfighting or fox hunting, both of which continued among the upper classes without legal consequence. The catchers who supplied the rats held complicated positions in this economy. They were necessary, for without a steady supply of healthy rats, the pits could not operate. Yet they were also somewhat despised, seen as men who profited from creatures that everyone else wished eliminated. The catcher who delivered rats on Saturday evening might be called the following Monday to catch rats in the home of a man who'd watched them die in the pit, and no one saw contradiction in this. The rats were currency, commodity, and enemy, their value shifting based on context, their deaths mourned by no one except perhaps other rats who found the nest diminished. The Crown and Anchor operated every Saturday evening from autumn through spring, closing during summer months when heat made the cellar unbearable. Other establishments ran the similar operations: the Queen's Head in Windmill Street, the Blue Anchor in Bunhill Row, the Spotted Dog in St George's East. Each had its regular clientele, its favoured dogs, its particular customs and traditions. A man might attend the same pit for years, knowing the other regulars, understanding the unspoken rules, participating in a community defined by shared appreciation for blood sport. The pits provided social function beyond mere entertainment, creating spaces where men of similar class could gather, could wager sums that elsewhere might seem insignificant, could shout and curse without judgment, could participate in spectacle that, however brutal, belonged to them in a way that opera and theatre never could. The sport would continue for decades more, surviving into the 1860s and beyond, though gradually pressure from reformers and changing social attitudes would force the pits to operate more discreetly, in back rooms and private cellars where police would not easily discover them. But in the 1850s, the rat pits flourished openly, and the catchers who supplied them made their living from death, and the dogs killed thousands upon thousands of rats, and the spectators wagered and shouted and went home satisfied, and London's rat population, despite the slaughter, never diminished, breeding faster than any number of dogs could kill them, ensuring that the sport and the trade that sustained it would continue unabated into futures that none of them would live to see. Chapter 5. The Children of the Sewers. The boy stood at the entrance to the tunnel, his bare feet already wet from the water that pooled at the threshold. He was perhaps 9 years old, thin as a rail, his face smudged with dirt that no amount of washing could fully remove. His name was Peter Finch, and he had been working as a tosher's assistant for 6 months, ever since his father had been crushed beneath a cart in Cheapside, and his mother had taken to the gin with such dedication that she no longer recognised her children. Peter's older brother had found him work with Mr. Garrett, a rat catcher who specialised in the sewers, who needed small hands and small bodies to reach places where grown men could not venture. The pay was threepence a day, enough to keep Peter in bread and occasionally a bit of bacon, enough to pay for a corner in a room he shared with 7 others, enough to keep him from the workhouse, which was the fate he feared above all others. The tunnel descended into darkness that seemed absolute, though Peter knew from experience that his eyes would adjust after a few minutes, that the darkness was never quite complete, that some light always filtered down from the gratings above. He carried no lamp, for Mr. Garrett believed that lamplight frightened the rats, made them retreat deeper into the tunnels where even Peter could not follow. Instead, Peter relied on his other senses, on the sound of water moving through the channels, on the smell that told him whether the sewer carried mostly rainwater or something fouler, on the feel of the walls that guided him through passages he had learned over months of daily descent into London's underworld. The Fleet River sewer ran beneath Farringdon Street, one of the ancient waterways that had once flowed open to the sky, but had been covered over generations ago as London expanded. The river still moved beneath the cobblestones, carrying waste from thousands of buildings, flowing south toward the Thames through tunnels that varied from 6 feet in height to passages where a man must crawl. Mr. Garrett waited at the surface with his sacks and cages, for he was too large to fit through many of the smaller passages, and his knees troubled him, making it difficult to work bent over for hours at a time. He relied on Peter and 2 other boys to do the actual catching, to venture into spaces where rats nested in such numbers that the tunnel walls seemed to move with their bodies. Peter descended the iron ladder set into the wall, his hands gripping rungs slick with slime, his feet finding purchase on metal that had been worn smooth by decades of use. The water at the bottom reached his ankles, cold enough to make him gasp, though he had learned not to cry out, for Mr. Garrett had no patience with complaints. The tunnel stretched in both directions, curving away into darkness, and Peter could hear the rats before he saw them, a rustling that never ceased, a chittering that echoed from the brickwork. He moved south toward the junction where the fleet met the Holborn tributary, where Mr. Garrett had told him the nests were largest, where they would find the quantities needed for Saturday's delivery to the pits. The rats in the sewers grew larger than their surface cousins, feeding on the constant flow of organic matter that passed through the tunnels. Some reached the size of small cats, their bodies sleek with moisture, their eyes reflecting what little light existed in dim red gleams that appeared and disappeared as they moved. These rats had never known daylight, had been born in darkness, and would die in darkness, their entire existence confined to the tunnels beneath the city. They had lost the wariness that surface rats retained, for nothing in the sewers threatened them except the occasional catcher, and catchers came rarely enough that the rats had not learned to fear human presence. Peter carried a sack and a small club, the only tools he needed for this work. His technique was simple, refined through repetition until it became automatic. He would approach a group of rats feeding on something in the water, moving slowly, making no sudden motions. When close enough, he would strike quickly with the club, stunning a rat, then grab it before it could recover and drop it into the sack. A skilled boy could catch 20 or 30 rats in an hour this way, though the work was exhausting, requiring constant alertness, for a rat that was not fully stunned would twist around to bite, and sewer rat bites festered worse than any other, infected by the filth that coated everything in the tunnels. The smaller passages presented different challenges. Peter would crawl on his belly through gaps that barely accommodated his thin frame, pushing the sack ahead of him, using his club to probe the darkness for rats. In these tight spaces, rats had nowhere to flee, and they would turn to fight, launching themselves at Peter's face and hands with desperate fury. He had learned to protect his eyes, to turn his head, to accept bites on his arms and shoulders that he could not prevent. His hands bore dozens of scars, thin white lines and puckered spots where infection had destroyed tissue. 2 fingers on his left hand no longer bent properly, the tendons damaged by a particularly savage bite that had become infected despite his attempts to clean it. Other boys worked the sewers as well, employed by different catchers, and the aide learned to recognise each other by sound in the darkness, by the particular rhythm of movement, by calls and whistles that identified who approached. Sometimes they would encounter each other at junctions or in larger chambers, and there would be brief conversation, information exchanged about where rats were numerous, which passages had collapsed, where the water ran too deep to work safely. But competition prevented real friendship, for each boy caught for his master, and rats taken by one meant fewer available for others. Fights occasionally erupted in the tunnels, boys struggling in darkness and water over territory, or perceived slights, though such conflicts rarely lasted long, for the sewers were dangerous enough without adding human violence to the natural hazards. The water level varied by weather and time of day. After heavy rain, the sewers could fill rapidly, and boys had drowned when caught in passages they could not escape quickly enough. The morning hours saw increased flow as households emptied chamber pots and businesses began their daily operations. Peter had learned to read the water, to judge by its speed and depth whether he should continue working or retreat to safety. Mr. Garrett had told him that a boy who drowned was no use to anyone, that better to lose a day's catch than to lose the boy himself, though Peter suspected this concern was more economic than humanitarian. Training a new boy required time and effort, and Mr. Garrett had invested both in Peter. The air in the sewers was foul beyond description, a mixture of methane and hydrogen sulfide and other gases whose names Peter did not know, but whose effects he understood. Breathing too deeply could cause dizziness, and more than one sewer worker had collapsed and died from gases that displaced the oxygen in their lungs. Peter had learned to breathe shallowly, to pause and retreat if he felt lightheaded, to recognise the particular smell that indicated dangerous concentrations. Some sections of the sewers were impassable without lamps or candles, but entering such spaces with flame risked explosion, for methane accumulated in pockets that could ignite with catastrophic force. Peter had heard stories of entire tunnel sections collapsing when gas exploded, of men and boys buried beneath tons of brick and earth, their bodies never recovered. The creatures that shared the sewers with rats included things that Peter tried not to think about too carefully. Eels swam in the deeper channels, thick as a man's arm, their skin black and slippery. Cockroaches covered the walls in places, their bodies crunching underfoot, their numbers so vast that the sound of them moving created a constant rustling whisper. In the older tunnels, where Roman brickwork still stood after 17 centuries, Peter sometimes glimpsed things he could not identify, shapes that moved differently than rats, that seemed larger, that retreated from his approach, leaving impressions in the mud that looked almost like handprints. He told no one of these sightings, for he feared Mr. Garrett would think him mad or lying, and in truth he was not certain what he had seen, whether the darkness and gases had created hallucinations, or whether something else lived in the depths beneath London. The work-age boys quickly. Peter started 6 months ago, looking much younger than his 9 years, small and weak from insufficient food. Now he appeared older, his face marked with a hardness that came from daily exposure to conditions that no child should endure. His cough had started 2 months ago, a deep rattling that would not leave his chest, that sometimes brought up blood. Other boys who worked the sewers had similar coughs, and Mr. Garrett said it came from breathing the bad air, that it would pass with time, though Peter noticed that men who had worked sewers for years coughed constantly, that many died young, their lungs destroyed by years of inhaling gases and dust and the spores of moulds that grew in the dampness. The tunnel widened ahead into a chamber where 3 passages converged, creating a space perhaps 12 feet across where the ceiling rose high enough for Peter to stand upright. The rats congregated here in extraordinary numbers, feeding on solids that had settled from the water flow, material that Peter tried not to examine too closely. He could see perhaps 100 rats in the dim light that filtered from a grating 2 stories above, their bodies packed together, climbing over one another in constant motion. This was what Mr. Garrett called a mother lode, a concentration that would fill multiple sacks, that would earn extra pennies for exceptional productivity. Peter set down his sack and advanced slowly into the chamber. The rats noticed him, but did not immediately flee, for they had learned that this space was theirs, that intruders were rare. He began working systematically, stunning rats on the periphery of the group, grabbing them quickly, dropping them into the sack. The rats' behaviour changed as their numbers diminished. The survivors began retreating, moving toward the tunnel entrances, their chittering growing louder, more frantic. Peter pursued them, working faster now, knowing that once they scattered into the tunnels, catching them individually would take hours. His club rose and fell with mechanical rhythm, his hands grabbed and released, and the sack grew heavier with each addition. A large rat, bigger than any Peter had yet seen, emerged from one of the side tunnels and moved directly toward him. This rat did not flee, but advanced with clear purpose, and Peter realized with sudden fear that it intended to attack. He raised his club, but the rat was faster than he expected, launching itself at his legs, its teeth sinking into his calf through the thin fabric of his trousers. Peter struck downward, catching the rat across its back, feeling bones break under the impact. The rat released its grip and fell into the water, stunned but not dead. Peter struck again, crushing its skull, then grabbed it and threw it into the sack with the others. Blood ran down his leg, mixing with the water, and he knew the wound would need attention, though attention would have to wait until the day's work was complete. He filled 2 sacks before the rats had scattered sufficiently that continuing was inefficient. The sacks were heavy, perhaps 40 pounds each, awkward to carry through the tunnels. Peter made multiple trips, dragging 1 sack to the ladder, then returning for the second, his wounded leg complaining with each step. The climb up the ladder was difficult with his hands occupied and his leg bleeding, but he managed it, emerging into afternoon light that seemed impossibly bright after hours in darkness. Mr. Garrett waited at the entrance, examining the catch, counting rapidly, nodding approval at the quantity. He noticed the blood on Peter's leg and told him to wash it in the water pump at the corner, that infection must be prevented if possible, though his tone suggested he had little faith in prevention. Other boys emerged from other entrances as the afternoon progressed, each bringing their own catches, each bearing new injuries or aggravating old ones. A boy named Timothy, who worked for a catcher in Clerkenwell, had a rat bite across his cheek, the flesh torn open in 3 parallel cuts that would certainly scar. A younger boy, perhaps 7 years old, cried from pain and exhaustion, and his master cuffed him roughly, telling him to be indignant that crying accomplished nothing. The boys stood in a ragged line while their masters examined and counted the catches, while money was counted out in pennies and halfpennies, while decisions were made about tomorrow's work and which tunnels would be explored next. Peter took his 3pence and walked toward his lodging, his leg throbbing with each step, his clothes soaked with sewer water, his hands raw from hours of work. He would eat if there was food available, would sleep if exhaustion allowed, and tomorrow he would descend again into the tunnels, would hunt rats in darkness, would risk drowning and disease and injury. Because this was the work he had, because the alternative was starvation or the workhouse, because he was 9 years old in Victorian London, and these were the choices available to children born into poverty. The sewers would take him eventually, as they took all the boys who worked them long enough, but until then he would continue day after day doing what was necessary to survive in a city that consumed children as readily as it consumed everything else that was weak and disposable. Chapter 6. The Poison Cellars. The shop stood on a narrow street off Cheapside, its window displaying coloured glass bottles arranged in rows behind iron bars that prevented theft. A sign above the door read Harrington's Chemical Supplies, painted in letters that had once been gold but had faded to a dull yellow-brown. Inside, the shop smelled of substances that had no natural analogue, sharp scents that made the eyes water, sweet odours that concealed deadliness, the chemical perfume of compounds that could heal or harm depending on dosage and application. Edmund Harrington had inherited the business from his father in 1847, and before that it had belonged to his grandfather, and the Harringtons had sold poisons in London since the days of George III. The shelves that lined the Thames walls held hundreds of bottles and jars, each labelled in careful script that identified contents and concentration. Arsenic oxide in various grades, strychnine sulfate, white phosphorus suspended in oil, mercury salts in multiple formulations, prussic acid in sealed vials, antimony compounds, lead acetate, copper arsenite for creating green pigments. The inventory represented capability for both legitimate and lethal purposes, for the same substances that killed rats could kill humans, and Harrington understood that his business existed in a moral territory that required careful navigation. The law regarding poison sales in 1850 was minimal, consisting primarily of common law precedents rather than specific statutes. A chemist could sell arsenic to anyone who requested it, though prudent merchants kept records of purchases and amounts, understanding that such records might prove valuable if questions arose after a suspicious death. Harrington maintained a ledger in which he noted every sale of substances he considered particularly dangerous, recording names and addresses when provided, descriptions when they were not. The ledger would not prevent a determined poisoner from obtaining materials, but it demonstrated that Harrington operated responsibly, that he took reasonable precautions, that he could not be held accountable for what customers did with their purchases. Rat catchers represented steady business, purchasing arsenic and strychnine in quantities that legitimate household pest control would not require. Harrington knew most of the regular catchers by sight, if not by name, recognised them by their distinctive smell and appearance, by the stains on their hands and clothing, by the casual way they discussed substances that would horrify ordinary citizens. A catcher might purchase a pound of arsenic powder at a time, enough to kill hundreds of rats or dozens of people, and Harrington would sell it without question, for the catcher's profession was known and the purpose understood. The price was 3 shillings per pound for arsenic of standard grade, more for purer formulations, and catchers paid without haggling, for they knew the market and understood that Harrington's prices were fair. Strychnine commanded higher prices due to its relative scarcity and more complex production. The substance derived from the seeds of the Strychnos nux vomica tree, which grew in India and was imported in limited quantities. Harrington purchased raw seeds from importers at the docks and extracted the alkaloid himself using techniques he had learned from his father. Processes that involved careful attention to detail and some risk of self-poisoning if proper precautions were not observed. The resulting white crystalline powder was extraordinarily bitter and extraordinarily toxic, with lethal dosage for an adult human being approximately 100 milligrams, about the weight of a few grains of rice. Harrington sold strychnine at 10 shillings per ounce, packaged in small bottles, clearly marked with skulls and written warnings. White phosphorus presented unique challenges in storage and sale. The substance ignited spontaneously when exposed to air at temperatures above 30 degrees, requiring that it be kept submerged in water or oil at all times. Harrington stored his phosphorus in sealed jars under water, kept in the coolest corner of his shop away from any heat source. When a customer purchased phosphorus, Harrington would carefully extract the required amount using tongs still underwater and transfer it to a jar the customer provided, ensuring no air exposure occurred during the transaction. Phosphorus sold for 15 shillings per pound, and Harrington warned purchasers about proper handling, though he knew some ignored these warnings and suffered burns or worse as a result. The customers who purchased poisons fell into several categories beyond rat catchers. Farmers bought arsenic and strychnine for controlling foxes and other predators that threatened livestock. Tanners used arsenic compounds in leather processing. Dyers and paint manufacturers purchased various metallic poisons for creating coloured pigments. Physicians occasionally bought strychnine in very small quantities for medicinal purposes, for in careful dosage it acted as a stimulant to the nervous system and was prescribed for various ailments. And then there were the customers whose purposes were less clear, who purchased small amounts with explanations that seemed plausible but not entirely convincing, who paid in cash and provided false names, who looked over their shoulders when entering the shop as if concerned about being observed. Harrington had sold poison to murderers, he was certain, though proving such a thing was nearly impossible unless the authorities specifically questioned him about a particular individual. A woman who purchased arsenic claiming she needed it for rats in her kitchen might in fact intend it for a husband whose insurance would solve her financial problems. A man who bought strychnine saying he had trouble with feral dogs might plan to use it on a business rival or inconvenient relative. Harrington could refuse sales when he suspected murderous intent, and occasionally he did, turning away customers whose demeanour or explanations raised sufficient concern. But mostly he sold what was requested, recorded the transaction, and tried not to think too carefully about ultimate purposes. The profession of poison selling carried social stigma despite its legality. Harrington was not invited to social gatherings, was not welcomed in churches, was regarded with suspicion by neighbours who knew his trade. Children were warned to stay away from his shop, told that the poison man was dangerous, that breathing the air near his door could cause illness. This isolation did not trouble Harrington overmuch, for he had never been particularly sociable, and his business provided income sufficient for comfortable living without requiring that he court public approval. He lived in rooms above the shop with his sister, who kept house and asked no questions about the business conducted below, and they maintained existence that was orderly if lonely. The preparation of rat poisons for sale to catchers required mixing the pure substances with bait materials that would attract rats while concealing the poison's presence. Harrington prepared these mixtures in a back room fitted with a ventilation system that drew air through charcoal filters before releasing it to the outside. He wore a leather apron and gloves during preparation, and a cloth mask over his mouth and nose, though he knew these precautions were only partially effective. Arsenic mixed with flour and lard created a paste that rats found appealing. Strychnine could be dissolved in honey and spread on bread. Phosphorus mixed with suet made cakes that glowed faintly in darkness, helping catchers track where they had placed bait. The danger to the preparer was constant and cumulative. Arsenic absorbed through skin, accumulated in the bomb, caused gradual poisoning that manifested as digestive troubles, skin changes, nerve damage. Harrington knew his own body carried significant arsenic burden, that his fingernails showed the characteristic white lines that indicated chronic exposure, that his digestion had never been robust since taking over the business. He expected he would not live to old age, that the poisons he handled daily would eventually overwhelm his system, but this seemed the inevitable cost of the profession his family had followed for 3 generations. Strychnine presented different hazards, for it did not accumulate but killed rapidly if sufficient dose was absorbed. The bitter taste usually prevented accidental ingestion, but inhalation of powder or absorption through cuts could prove fatal. Harrington had experienced mild strychnine poisoning twice, both times from breathing dust while grinding seeds. The symptoms began with heightened sensory perception, everything appearing brighter and louder, followed by muscle stiffness, then tremors, then convulsions. He had survived because the doses were small and he had immediately induced vomiting, but both experiences had been terrifying and he now took extraordinary care when working with the substance. The relationship between poison sellers and rat catchers was one of mutual dependence. Catchers required reliable sources of effective poisons, and they needed sellers who would not ask questions or refuse sales based on quantity. Harrington provided this service, understanding that the alternative would be catchers purchasing from less scrupulous sources, perhaps obtaining adulterated or improperly prepared poisons that might harm them or fail to work as expected. By maintaining quality and availability, Harrington ensured that catchers returned to his shop, that they recommended him to others in their trade, that steady business continued year after year. Some catchers preferred to purchase pure poisons and prepare their own baits, believing they could do better than commercial preparations. Harrington sold to these customers without argument, though he privately thought them foolish to handle concentrated poisons without proper equipment or training. Several regular customers had died over the years from accidents during poison preparation, and Harrington had attended their inquests, had testified about what he had sold them, had been cleared of responsibility because the law placed no duty on sellers to prevent buyers from poisoning themselves. These deaths troubled him in abstract fashion, but they did not change his business practices, for death was commonplace in Victorian London, and a poison seller who worried too much about mortality would find it impossible to continue his profession. The shop bell rang throughout each day as customers entered, seeking their various poisons. Harrington served each with the same careful attention, measuring exact amounts, explaining proper usage, warning about hazards, collecting payment. His hands moved through motions refined by years of repetition, selecting bottles, pouring powders, wrapping packages in brown paper, sealing them with wax. The work was monotonous, but required constant alertness, for a mistake in measurement or labelling could have catastrophic consequences. A customer who received strychnine thinking it was something less toxic might use inappropriate quantity and die before the error was discovered. The afternoon brought Thomas Archer, the rat catcher from St. Giles, who purchased a pound of arsenic and 4 ounces of strychnine. Harrington knew Archer as a reliable customer who paid promptly and never requested credit. They discussed the relative merits of different poison formulations for various rat populations, with Archer explaining that sewer rats required stronger doses than surface rats, that rats in the docks had developed some tolerance to arsenic through constant low-level exposure to the substance in ships' cargoes. Harrington suggested trying strychnine in areas where arsenic seemed less effective, and Archer agreed to experiment, saying he would report results when he returned next month. Evening brought the shop's closing, and Harrington locked the door, drew the curtains and began his nightly inventory, checking stock levels, noting what needed ordering, calculating the day's receipts. The money was good, as it had been yesterday and would be tomorrow, for London's rat problem ensured constant demand for the substances that killed them. Harrington climbed the stairs to his rooms, washed his hands and face in water that he changed 3 times, trying to remove the chemical residues that clung to his skin despite precautions. His sister had prepared a simple meal, and they ate in silence. As was their custom, neither one inclined toward conversation after long days of their respective labours. Sleep came eventually, though Harrington's dreams were often troubled, filled with images of rats and poisons, of customers whose faces he could not quite see, of bottles that broke and spilled their contents, of gases that filled rooms until breathing became impossible. He would wake in darkness, momentarily uncertain where he was, then recognise the familiar outlines of his bedroom, would hear his sister moving in the adjacent room, would know that morning would bring another day of selling death in small measured doses to a city that required such services. The poison trade would continue as it had for generations, as it would for decades more, until laws changed or society evolved beyond the need for substances that killed so efficiently, though Harrington could not imagine either occurrence happening within his lifetime. Chapter 7. The Secret Market. The anatomist's rooms occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Windmill Street, a location chosen for its proximity to the hospitals and medical schools that clustered around Covent Garden. The windows had been painted over on the inside, preventing anyone in adjacent buildings from observing what occurred within. A single lamp burned on a table, illuminating instruments arranged with surgical precision: scalpels, saws, hooks, forceps, containers of various sizes. On a slab in the centre of the room lay a body, covered with a stained sheet that did not quite conceal the shape beneath. Dr. Henry Blackwell worked late most evenings, for his studies required privacy and uninterrupted concentration, and the subjects he examined were not obtained through official channels. The shortage of cadavers for anatomical study was a problem that had plagued British medicine for decades. The Murder Act of 1752 had designated the bodies of executed criminals for dissection, but executions had become less frequent as the century progressed, and the number of bodies legally available fell far short of what medical education required. The Anatomy Act of 1832 had attempted to address the shortage by permitting the use of unclaimed bodies from workhouses and hospitals, but even this expansion proved insufficient. Medical schools needed dozens of bodies each year for student training, and doctors conducting private research required additional specimens. This demand created a market, and where markets existed, enterprising individuals found ways to supply what was needed. Thomas Archer knew this market well, for rat catchers moved through the same spaces as the men who supplied anatomists with bodies. The rookeries and slums where rats were most numerous were also where people died unclaimed and unmourned, where a body might disappear without extensive investigation. Archer did not himself engage in the procurement of human cadavers, but he knew those who did, and he occasionally performed services for them that generated income beyond his normal rat-catching activities. These services operated in legal grey areas, not quite illegal, but certainly not respectable, and Archer preferred not to discuss them in detail even with other catchers. The simplest additional income came from selling rat bodies to establishments that used them for purposes beyond simple disposal. Some medical students practiced surgical techniques on rats before progressing to larger animals, learning to make incisions, to ligate vessels, to suture wounds. A rat's anatomy, while obviously different from human anatomy, provided useful training for developing manual dexterity and understanding basic biological structures. Archer could sell rat carcasses to certain medical schools for a penny each, a negligible amount individually, but meaningful when multiplied by hundreds of rats. The rats delivered to medical schools needed to be fresh, killed within hours of delivery, and relatively intact without extensive crushing or tearing. Teeth represented another market, particularly rats' incisors, which grew continuously throughout the animal's life and remained sharp and strong. These teeth could be sold to manufacturers who incorporated them into various products. Some were ground into powder for use in medicines of dubious efficacy. Others were used by denture makers, though not for the dentures themselves, but for testing and adjusting the fit of human teeth that had been extracted for use in dental appliances. The market for rat teeth was small but reliable. An archer collected teeth from rats he killed, extracting them with pliers, storing them in jars until he accumulated quantities worth selling. The darker transactions occurred after midnight, in locations that changed regularly to avoid pattern that might attract official attention. These meetings involved men whose names Archer never learned, who paid in cash for items they did not describe in detail, who understood that questions would end the relationship immediately. Archer had been approached initially by a man he knew only as Mr. Howard, who had observed him working in St. Giles and had subsequently contacted him with a proposition. Mr. Howard required access to certain buildings in the rookeries, buildings where people died with some frequency, and he needed someone familiar with these locations who could inform him when deaths occurred before the parish authorities were notified. The work required no physical labour from Archer, only observation and timely communication. When he encountered a death during his rat-catching rounds, and such encounters were frequent in the rookeries, where disease and malnutrition and despair killed constantly, he would note the location and report it to Mr. Howard at their next scheduled meeting. Mr. Howard would pay 5 shillings for useful information, more if the death was recent and the body not yet discovered by others. What Mr. Howard did with this information, Archer did not ask, though he understood that bodies were being procured for medical purposes through means that skirted legality at best. The system worked because the rookeries were largely ungoverned spaces, where official processes functioned poorly if at all. A person who died in a tenement might lie undiscovered for days, and when finally found, might be buried in a pauper's grave without ceremony or documentation. If a body disappeared before official discovery, the absence went unremarked, for record-keeping in the rookeries was minimal. The parish beadle who was supposed to document deaths rarely ventured into the worst districts, preferring to accept second-hand reports and to avoid personal inspection of conditions he found distasteful. This neglect created opportunities for men like Mr. Howard and for catchers like Archer, who supplied information that enabled their operations. Archer felt no particular guilt about these activities, for the people whose deaths he reported were beyond caring what happened to their bodies, and the doctors who received cadavers performed work that might eventually benefit the living. This was the rationalization he offered himself on nights when his conscience troubled him, though in truth his conscience troubled him rarely. He had been born into poverty, had struggled his entire life against circumstances that offered few options for advancement, and he took money where he found it, within limits he defined for himself. He did not kill, did not steal from the living, did not harm children. These were his boundaries, and within them he operated with the pragmatism required for survival in Victorian London. Other items moved through these same channels, creating a shadow economy that paralleled the legitimate trade. Hair cut from corpses could be sold for wig making, commanding prices based on length and colour. Teeth extracted from the dead supplied denture makers with genuine human teeth, which were preferred over ivory or porcelain alternatives. The clothes in which people died, if they owned any of value, could be resold after cleaning. Even the fat rendered from bodies had commercial applications, though Archer drew a line at involvement in such trade, finding it too macabre even for his hardened sensibilities. The rat catchers who engaged in these various side businesses formed a loose network, sharing information about opportunities and risks, warning each other when authorities showed increased interest in particular activities. They met occasionally in pubs where their presence attracted no special notice, where they could speak quietly in corners without being overheard. These gatherings were not social occasions exactly, for catchers did not form friendships easily, but they served practical purposes, allowing coordination that benefited all participants. If the police began investigating body snatching in a particular district, word would spread through this network, and activities would shift to other locations until attention waned. The anatomists themselves rarely interacted directly with catchers, maintaining distance that provided plausible deniability if questions arose. Instead, intermediaries like Mr. Howard handled transactions, accepting risk in exchange for profit, creating layers of separation between the ultimate recipients of bodies and the means by which those bodies were obtained. Dr. Blackwell, working in his rooms on Windmill Street, could claim ignorance of procurement methods if challenged, could produce receipts from legitimate suppliers while never mentioning other sources. This system protected all parties, allowing medical research to continue while minimizing risk of prosecution under laws that were unclear about what exactly constituted illegal body procurement. The work Archer did for Mr. Howard required qualities beyond those needed for rat catching. He must be observant, noting details that others might miss. Which buildings housed the very old or very sick? Which rooms contained people who lived alone? Which landlords were negligent in checking on tenants? He must be discreet, never discussing what he observed or reported, never asking questions that might reveal his involvement to others. He must be reliable, showing up at appointed times, providing accurate information, following instructions without deviation. In return, he received payments that supplemented his rat-catching income significantly, allowing him to afford better lodging, more regular meals, even small luxuries like tobacco and occasional visits to the theatre. The meetings with Mr. Howard followed established pattern. They would encounter each other apparently by chance at a designated location, usually a street corner or public house entrance, and would walk together while conversing about innocuous topics. During this walk, Archer would relay whatever information he'd gathered, speaking in coded language that an observer would not recognize as significant. Mr. Howard would respond with questions or instructions, and money would change hands invisibly, slip from one palm to another in a gesture that looked like nothing more than two men shaking hands in greeting or farewell. The entire interaction would consume perhaps 5 minutes, and then they would part, and Archer would return to his rat-catching, and Mr. Howard would disappear into the city to pursue whatever business he conducted. The secret market functioned efficiently because all participants understood their roles and maintained discipline that prevented exposure. The anatomists obtained the cadavers they needed. The intermediaries earned substantial profits from facilitating transactions. The catchers received supplemental income that made their difficult lives more bearable. And the dead, who had no voice in the matter, served purposes in death that their poverty had prevented them from serving in life. The morality of this arrangement was debatable, but morality had limited currency in the rookeries, where survival took precedence over ethical considerations, where each person did what was necessary to endure another day in a city that consumed the poor without mercy or memory. Chapter 8. The Great Stink. The summer of 1858 arrived early in London, bringing heat that settled over the city like a smothering blanket and refused to lift. By the first week of June, temperatures had climbed into the 80s, and the Thames, which had served for centuries as London's primary sewer, began to release odours that made the air itself seem poisonous. The river had been declining for decades, growing progressively more polluted as the city's population swelled beyond the capacity of any infrastructure to manage the waste of 3 million people. The introduction of flush toilets in wealthier homes, intended as a mark of progress and civilization, had made matters catastrophically worse, for these devices sent human waste directly into the river rather than into cesspits where it would remain relatively contained. The heat intensified the stench beyond anything London had previously experienced. The smell rose from the Thames in visible waves, a miasma that hung over the river and spread through every street within a mile of its banks. Parliament itself, whose chambers overlooked the Thames from Westminster, became uninhabitable. Members attempted to conduct business, but found concentration impossible. Their handkerchiefs soaked in chloride of lime and pressed to their faces, the windows draped with curtains soaked in the same solution in futile attempts to filter the air. The smell penetrated everything, seeping through closed doors and windows, clinging to clothing and hair, invading lungs until members reported feeling physically ill from the mere act of breathing. The crisis that newspapers christened the Great Stink forced London to confront problems it had ignored for generations. The medieval sewage system, such as it was, consisted primarily of open ditches and ancient rivers that had been covered over as the city expanded. These channels emptied into the Thames, which was expected to carry waste downstream on the tide. But the tide brought waste upstream as well, and the sheer volume overwhelmed the river's capacity to flush itself clean. Raw sewage floated visibly in the water, forming rafts of solid matter that moved back and forth with each tide cycle, accumulating in eddies and backwaters where it decomposed in the summer heat. The rats of London responded to these conditions with explosive population growth. The Thames river banks, at low tide, revealed expanses of mud rich with organic matter, and rats fed there in such numbers that the ground seemed to move with their bodies. They bred in the sewers that emptied into the river, in the basements of buildings along the embankment, in the countless spaces where London's foundations met the water. Thomas Archer and every other rat catcher in the city found themselves overwhelmed with work called to addresses, from Lambeth to Limehouse, hired by households and businesses desperate to control infestations that seemed to grow despite all efforts. The demand exceeded supply by such margin that catchers could charge double and triple their normal rates and still turn away more work than they could accept. Archer worked 18 hours daily through that summer, beginning before dawn and continuing until well past midnight, setting traps, checking traps, collecting dead rats, delivering live ones to the pits, then starting the cycle again. His terrier Jack killed until exhausted, slept briefly and killed again. The sacks of dead rats accumulated faster than they could be disposed of, and the city contracted with wagons to collect carcasses and haul them to lime pits outside the urban core, where they were burned or buried in quantities that would have seemed impossible in normal times. The heat made the work almost unbearable. Archer moved through buildings where the temperature inside exceeded that outside, where air did not circulate, where the smell of rats living and dead mixed with the pervasive stench from the river to create an atmosphere that was nearly suffocating. He lost weight despite eating more than usual, for the labour and the heat consumed energy faster than food could replace it. Other catchers suffered similarly, their faces gaunt, their clothing hanging loose, their hands trembling from exhaustion. Several died that summer, collapsing from heat exhaustion or heart strain, their bodies discovered in alleys or cellars where they had gone to work and had not emerged. The children who worked the sewers found conditions even more dangerous than usual. The heat increased gas production in the tunnels, creating pockets of methane that could explode or displace oxygen entirely. 3 boys died in a single incident when they descended into a sewer on Borough High Street and were overcome by gas, collapsing into water barely a foot deep, drowning because they lacked consciousness to lift their faces above the surface. Their bodies were not recovered for 2 days, and when finally brought up, the gases had bloated them beyond recognition. Peter Finch heard of their deaths and understood that the same fate might claim him, but he continued working, for the alternative was unemployment. And in the summer of the Great Stink, even dangerous work paid better than no work at all. Parliament, faced with conditions that made legislative business nearly impossible, moved with unusual speed to address the crisis. The Metropolitan Board of Works was granted emergency powers and funding to begin construction of a comprehensive sewage system designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette. The project would take years to complete, requiring the excavation of 82 miles of intercepting sewers and the construction of massive pumping stations. But the Great Stink had finally created political will to attempt what decades of ordinary misery had failed to motivate. In the meantime, lime was poured into the Thames by the ton, chalk was spread along the exposed riverbanks at low tide, and instructions were issued to households to avoid disposing of waste into the river if alternative arrangements could be made. These measures had limited effect. The lime whitened the water but did not eliminate the organic matter that caused the smell. The chalk dried the riverbanks temporarily but was washed away by the next tide. Households that tried to contain their waste found themselves with overflowing cesspits that required emptying by night soil men, whose services cost money that many could not afford. The crisis continued through June, through July into August, with temperatures remaining elevated, and the stench persisting day after day until it seemed to be a permanent feature of London life, something that had always existed and would exist forever. The rat catchers worked through the summer in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Archer's hands developed sores that would not heal, infected by the constant exposure to filth and rat bites. His cough, which had been minor, became persistent, bringing up phlegm that was sometimes streaked with blood. He developed a fever that came and went, leaving him shaking and weak. But he could not afford to stop working, for the money he earned that summer represented more than he might make in a normal year. Other catchers reported similar symptoms, and several developed diseases that would kill them before winter arrived. Cholera, typhoid, infections that spread from untreated wounds. The sporting pits ran continuous matches through the summer, for the supply of rats seemed inexhaustible, and demand for entertainment remained strong despite the heat. The Crown and Anchor held matches 6 nights weekly instead of its usual Saturday evening schedule, and still could not accommodate all who wished to attend. The pit itself grew rank with the smell of dead rats and dog blood, and sawdust that was supposed to absorb moisture became saturated and began to rot. But spectators came anyway, packing the cellar until the heat and press of bodies created conditions nearly as foul as those outside. The dogs killed thousands of rats that summer, and the rats were replaced immediately, and the cycle continued without pause. The poison sellers found their stocks depleted, and struggled to obtain new supplies. Harrington ordered arsenic and strychnine in quantities that exceeded his previous annual usage, and still found himself turning away customers because he lacked inventory to meet demand. The prices of poisons rose accordingly, with arsenic reaching 6 shillings per pound and strychnine doubling to 20 shillings per ounce. Catchers paid these inflated prices without complaint, for they could pass costs to customers who were desperate enough to accept any terms. The poisons killed rats by the thousand, but the rat population seemed unaffected, for new rats arrived, constantly from the sewers and river, attracted by the abundant food that London's waste provided. The summer wore on, and London adapted to conditions that would have been considered intolerable in any previous era. People moved through the streets with handkerchiefs pressed to faces, breathing through fabric soaked in vinegar or camphor. Those who could afford to leave the city did so, fleeing to the countryside or the coast until the heat broke. Those who remained endured, for they had no choice, their lives too tightly bound to London to permit escape. The poor suffered most severely, crowded into rookeries where the heat was trapped and magnified, where ventilation was non-existent, where the only water available came from pumps that might be contaminated by sewage seeping through soil from nearby cesspits. The medical community debated the mechanism by which the stench caused illness. The prevailing theory held that disease arose from miasmas, from bad air itself, though a few voices argued that some invisible agent transmitted through water might be responsible for the cholera and typhoid that inevitably followed the Great Stink. Dr. John Snow had published his theory of waterborne disease transmission years earlier, but most physicians remained sceptical, preferring explanations based on miasma and moral failing. The debate would continue for years, though eventually Snow's theory would be vindicated, and London would understand that the river that had seemed so vast and inexhaustible was in fact killing them, slowly but surely, every time they drank from it or allowed its waters to touch their skin. August brought relief in the form of storms that broke the heat and rain that washed the streets and temporarily cleansed the air. The temperature dropped, the smell diminished, and Parliament returned to something approaching normal function. The crisis passed, though its effects would linger for months and years. The rats that had bred so prolifically during the summer did not simply disappear when conditions improved. They remained in the city, their population sustained by the infrastructure of filth that continued to exist even after the Great Stink faded from immediate concern. The catchers continued their work, though at more sustainable pace, and life in London resumed its ordinary patterns of misery and endurance. Archer counted his earnings from that summer and found he had accumulated nearly £20, more wealth than he had possessed at any previous point in his life. He paid off debts, purchased new equipment, and set aside money against future need, for he understood that such extraordinary circumstances would not repeat, that normal times meant normal poverty. His health remained poor, the cough persisting, the fever returning occasionally, but he considered himself fortunate to have survived when others had not. The Great Stink of 1858 would be remembered as the event that finally forced London to address its sewage crisis. But for the rat catchers who had worked through that summer, it would be remembered as the season when their labour was finally valued at something approaching its true worth, when the city acknowledged, however briefly, that the men who fought rats in darkness and filth performed services that civilization required but preferred not to contemplate. Chapter 9. The Catcher's Death. The room in which Thomas Archer lay dying measured perhaps 8 feet square, with a single window that looked onto a narrow courtyard where no sunlight penetrated. He had lived in this room for 7 years, had paid his rent each Monday without fail, had maintained the space as well as his circumstances permitted. Now, in November of 1862, he lay on a pallet in the corner, covered with a blanket that did little to ward off the cold that seeped through walls never intended to provide real shelter. His breathing had become laboured, each inhalation requiring conscious effort, and his lungs rattled with fluid that no amount of coughing could clear. He was 39 years old, though he appeared far older, his face hollow, his body wasted to skeletal thinness. The fever had begun 3 weeks prior, a familiar sensation that he had experienced many times, but which had never persisted so long or burned so intensely. At first he had continued working, for catchers did not have the luxury of rest when illness struck. But within days he found himself too weak to carry his equipment, too dizzy to navigate the alleys safely. He had been forced to stop, to retire to his room, to hope that rest and time would restore strength as they had on previous occasions. But this time the fever did not break and the weakness deepened, and he came to understand with the clarity that sometimes accompanies approaching death that he would not recover from this illness. Jack, his terrier, lay at the foot of the pallet, refusing to leave despite having been without proper food for days. The dog had grown old in service, his muzzle grey, his movements stiff, but his loyalty remained absolute. Other residents of the building occasionally pushed scraps under the door for the dog, though no one entered the room, for Archer's illness was likely contagious, and the poor could not afford the charity that might cost them their own health. The landlord had not yet moved to evict Archer, though rent had gone unpaid for 2 weeks, perhaps because removing a dying man raised legal complications, or perhaps because even landlords occasionally recognised futility in actions that would change nothing. The illness had begun in the lungs, as Archer had known it would. Years of breathing the air of sewers and cellars, of handling dead rats, of working in spaces filled with dust and mould and noxious gases, had destroyed lung tissue gradually but inexorably. The cough that had troubled him for years had evolved from occasional nuisance to constant companion, and blood had appeared in what he coughed up with increasing frequency. Doctor visits were beyond his financial reach, and the free dispensaries where the poor might receive treatment were overwhelmed with patients and could offer little beyond diagnosis that Archer already understood. His lungs were failing, infection had taken hold, and without treatment that did not exist for men in his circumstances, death was the inevitable conclusion. The disease that consumed him was likely tuberculosis, though the term meant little to Archer, who knew it only as consumption, the wasting disease that killed more Londoners than any other ailment except cholera. Tuberculosis thrived in conditions common to the rookeries: overcrowding, poor ventilation, inadequate nutrition, the constant dampness that prevented buildings from ever truly drying. Archer had probably been infected years ago, the bacteria establishing themselves in his lungs, multiplying slowly, waiting for his body to weaken sufficiently that they could overwhelm his defences. The Great Stink Summer had accelerated the process, the extreme conditions exhausting him beyond his body's capacity to recover, creating the opening that the disease required. Other catchers had died from similar causes, their deaths so common as to attract little notice. A catcher might work for 15 or 20 years before succumbing, though few lasted longer, their lungs destroyed by the environment in which they laboured. Some died quickly from accidents, falls in sewers, drowning in tunnels, crushing injuries and collapsed buildings. Others developed infections from rat bites that spread to their blood, causing fevers that killed within days. Poisoning, claimed a few, either from careless handling of the substances they used or from deliberate consumption when despair became overwhelming. But most died as Archer was dying, slowly consumed by lung disease, drowning gradually in their own fluids, their bodies wasting as the infection consumed tissue faster than food could replace it. The pain was significant, though Archer had experienced worse during his years of work. His chest hurt with each breath, a burning sensation that radiated from his lungs to his shoulders. His joints ached from the fever, and moving required effort that left him exhausted. But worse than physical pain was the certain knowledge of what approached, the understanding that death would arrive within days or perhaps hours, and that there would be no intervention, no miraculous recovery, no reprieve. He had seen other men die in the rookeries, had witnessed the process countless times, and he recognised in his own symptoms the same progression that had preceded their ends. His thoughts turned to his life, to the years spent hunting rats through darkness, to the countless nights in cellars and sewers, to the work that had consumed him entirely and left nothing else. He had never married, for what woman would attach herself to a rat catcher whose prospects were non-existent and whose life expectancy was short? He had no children, no family that claimed him, no friends beyond the casual acquaintances formed with other catchers. His legacy, such as it was, consisted of thousands of dead rats and money spent on survival, leaving no trace that would survive his passing. This thought did not trouble him particularly, for he had never expected anything different, had understood from youth that his life would be hard and short and unremarkable. The practicalities of his death concerned him more than the philosophical implications. His body would need disposal, and he had no funds to pay for burial. The parish would take responsibility eventually, would arrange for his corpse to be transported to a common grave where dozens of others would be interred in the same pit, covered with lime, forgotten within hours. His possessions would be claimed by the landlord against unpaid rent, though they held little value. Some tools, few items of clothing, nothing of significance. Jack would face uncertain fate, for the landlord would not keep a dog, and finding someone willing to adopt an old terrier was unlikely. Archer hoped someone would take the dog rather than simply turning it into the street, but he had no means to ensure this outcome. The room grew darker as the evening approached, though Archer had lost track of time, uncertain whether it was the same day that had dawned or whether days had passed unnoticed. Sound from outside penetrated the walls, voices, footsteps, the normal life of the rookery continuing regardless of his condition. He heard children playing in the courtyard, their laughter incongruous against the misery that surrounded them. He heard a woman shouting at someone, her words indistinct but her anger clear. He heard a man coughing in an adjacent room, the deep rattling cough that indicated lung disease similar to his own, and wondered whether that man too would be dead soon, whether they would share a grave in the potter's field. The night brought increased suffering, for the fever rose with darkness and the pain in his chest intensified. Archer drifted between consciousness and delirium, his mind producing visions that mixed memory with hallucination. He saw rats, thousands of them, moving through tunnels that stretched infinitely in all directions. He saw faces of men he had known, other catchers who had died over the years, their features pale and spectral. He saw the crown and anchor pit, but instead of rats and dogs, he saw himself inside, climbing walls that extended upward beyond sight, trying to escape while spectators watched and wagered on how long he would last. Morning came eventually, bringing weak light through the window, and Archer found himself still conscious, still breathing, though the effort required to maintain these functions was increasing. Jack stirred at his feet, whining softly, and Archer reached out with effort to touch the dog's head, to provide what comfort he could to the creature that had been his companion through years of work. The dog licked his hand, and Archer felt tears form, not from fear of death, but from grief for the dog's uncertain future, from sorrow for a loyalty that he could not reward, for devotion that would bring the animal nothing but abandonment. The morning progressed, and Archer felt his strength continuing to ebb, felt his consciousness becoming less secure, felt the boundaries between waking and dreaming begin to dissolve. His breathing grew more irregular, long pauses between inhalations, his body struggling to continue processes that were failing. The pain began to recede, replaced by numbness that spread from his extremities toward his core, and he understood that this was the beginning of the end, that his body was shutting down in the orderly fashion that preceded death. His final thoughts were not profound, not revelatory, but simple and immediate. He thought of the rent he owed. He thought of Jack. He thought of the traps still set somewhere in the rookery, rats probably caught in them, no one coming to collect them. He thought of the sewers beneath the city, still filled with rats, continuing their endless breeding regardless of how many catchers killed how many thousands. He thought that his death would make no difference, that another catcher would take his roots, that the work would continue, that London would go on unchanged, consuming catchers and rats alike in its perpetual hunger for labour and death. The final breath came without drama, a shallow inhalation that was not followed by exhalation, the process simply stopping as systems failed beyond recovery. Thomas Archer died on November 18th, 1862, in a rented room in St. Giles, unmourned and unnoticed except by a dog who remained beside the body for 2 days before hunger finally drove it to leave in search of food. The landlord discovered the corpse on the 3rd day, reported it to the parish, and had it removed for burial in the common grave that had been its inevitable destination. No stone marked the spot, no record preserved the name, and within weeks even the building's residents had forgotten that Thomas Archer had ever existed, for death in the rookeries was too common to warrant memory. Chapter 10. The Shadow Fades. The year 1875 marked 13 years since Thomas Archer's death, and London had transformed in ways that would have astonished him had he lived to witness them. The great sewers designed by Joseph Bazalgette were complete, their construction having required a decade of labour and the excavation of 3.5 million cubic yards of earth. 82 miles of intercepting sewers now ran beneath the city, collecting waste from smaller tributaries and carrying it downstream to outfalls beyond the populated areas, where it was released into the Thames at high tide. The system worked, not perfectly, but far better than what had existed. Before, and the Thames itself had begun to recover, fish were returning to waters that had been lifeless for generations. The transformation of London's sanitation infrastructure had direct consequences for the rat-catching trade. The new sewers were built of brick, with smooth interior surfaces that gave rats fewer places to nest. The improved flow carried waste away more efficiently, reducing the accumulation of organic matter that had sustained vast rat populations. Access points to the sewers were secured with iron grates that prevented entry by children and made it more difficult for catchers to work the tunnels. The Metropolitan Board of Works employed its own staff to maintain the sewers, men who were not precisely rat catchers, but who performed similar functions as part of their official duties, eliminating infestations before they could become established. Above ground, changes occurred as well, though more gradually. The worst of the rookeries were being demolished, their buildings condemned and razed to make way for new construction that, while hardly luxurious, at least met minimum standards for light and ventilation. St. Giles, which had festered for centuries, was cleared street by street, its residents dispersed to other districts, the land sold to developers who erected buildings designed with some attention to preventing the conditions that bred disease. The old warrens where rats and humans had coexisted in nearly equal numbers were disappearing, replaced by structures that, while still housing the poor, did so in ways that reduced vermin populations to more manageable levels. The rat catchers found their trade declining accordingly. William Hatch, who had supplied traps for decades, found orders diminishing year by year. By 1875, his workshop produced perhaps a quarter of the volume it had managed in the 1850s, and much of that went to export, shipped to colonial cities where sanitation remained primitive and rat problems continued unabated. Hatch had trained no apprentice to replace him, understanding that the trade would not survive his retirement, and he worked alone in his cellar, filling occasional orders, living on savings accumulated during better years, waiting for death that would arrive before much longer. Edmund Harrington still operated his chemical supply shop, though the poison trade had changed considerably. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had imposed new regulations on the sale of dangerous substances, requiring that purchases be recorded in a register, and that certain poisons be sold only to persons known to the seller or properly identified. Arsenic sold for domestic use now had to be mixed with soot or indigo dye to make it visible and less likely to be confused with flour or sugar. These regulations reduced accidental poisonings and made deliberate poisoning more difficult to accomplish undetected, but they also added complexity and cost to transactions that had previously been simple. The market for live rats had collapsed entirely with the gradual suppression of rat pits. The sport had not been made illegal, but increased pressure from reformed societies and changing social attitudes had made public rat fights less acceptable. The Crown and Anchor continued to hold matches occasionally, but they now occurred monthly rather than weekly, in back rooms rather than dedicated pits, attracting smaller crowds of aging men who remembered when such entertainment had been commonplace. James Wakefield, who had owned the establishment, had died in 1870, and his son lacked enthusiasm for maintaining traditions that were clearly dying. By 1875, most former rat pits had closed entirely, and catchers who had relied on selling live rats had been forced to find other employment or accept poverty. The children who had worked the sewers were gone, eliminated not by reform or compassion, but by the new sewer system that made their labour obsolete. The tunnels were too well sealed for easy access, and the rats that remained were too few to justify the risk of sending boys into spaces that were now official property of the Board of Works. Peter Finch, who had survived his years in the sewers, had transitioned to work as a general labourer, finding employment at the docks loading cargo. His lungs were damaged, his health permanently compromised, but he had survived to adulthood, which was more than could be said for many who had shared his occupation. He occasionally thought of the tunnels, of the darkness and the rats, and he felt no nostalgia for work that had nearly killed him multiple times. The rat catchers who remained in 1875 were older men, practitioners of a trade that had no future, serving a market that was shrinking toward obsolescence. A few still worked the remaining slums, still set their traps in buildings that had not yet been improved, still delivered dead rats to households that paid less than half what they had commanded 2 decades earlier. But their numbers had declined through death and retirement and simple economic reality that made the work increasingly unprofitable. Young men no longer apprenticed as catchers, for the trade offered no prospects, and other employment was available that paid better and carried less risk. The dogs that had fought in the pits found new purposes, or were destroyed when they became superfluous. Some terriers were sold to country estates where they worked, as ratters in barns and stables, performing their function in more traditional settings. Others were kept as pets by people who admired their courage and tenacity, though dogs trained for killing often adjusted poorly to domestic life. Many were simply drowned or clubbed to death when their fighting days ended, for maintaining animals that no longer generated income was charity that few could afford. The memory of the old trade faded quickly, for Victorian London moved forward with determination to forget its recent past. The rookeries and their horrors were being erased from the physical landscape, and the activities that had flourished in those spaces were erased from consciousness with equal thoroughness. Respectable society had never acknowledged the rat catchers, had never granted them recognition or respect, and their disappearance went unmarked except in the neighbourhoods where they had worked. The men who had descended into sewers and cellars, who had fought rats in darkness, who had risked disease and injury for pittances that barely sustained life, these men died unknown and were buried in unmarked graves, their contribution to London's functioning unrecorded in any official history. The rat population of London did not disappear with the decline of the catchers, for rats were adaptable creatures that had survived alongside humans for millennia and would continue to do so. But their numbers diminished significantly with the improvement of sanitation, and their behaviour changed as well. The rats that remained learned to avoid human spaces more carefully, to nest in places less accessible, to feed more discreetly. They became invisible again, as they had been before the explosion of population in the early Victorian era. Present but not overwhelming, a problem that could be managed rather than a crisis that demanded daily combat. By 1880, the trade of rat catching as it had existed in the mid-19th century was effectively extinct. A few old men still called themselves catchers, still carried traps and walked familiar routes, but they were anachronisms, relics of an era that London had moved beyond. The city's approach to pest control had become systematised, incorporated into the official structures of municipal government, performed by employees of the Board of Works rather than independent contractors operating in legal grey areas. This represented progress, unquestionably, for the new system was more effective and more humane than what had preceded it. Yet something was lost as well in this transition, though perhaps nothing worth mourning. The rat catchers had embodied a kind of knowledge that was disappearing from London, an understanding of the city's hidden spaces, of its underground geography, of the behaviours and patterns of creatures that shared human space while remaining largely unseen. They had operated in realms that respectable society never visited, had performed labour that was necessary but degrading, had lived lives that were hard and short and offered no reward beyond basic survival. Their passing marked the end of a particular kind of relationship with urban space, a relationship defined by intimacy with filth and darkness, by willingness to work in conditions that others fled from, by acceptance of danger and degradation as the price of employment. The last rat catcher in St. Giles died in 1883, in a room not much different from the one where Thomas Archer had died 20 years earlier. His name was not recorded, his death noticed only by the landlord who needed to clear the room, for a new tenant. He had no dog, no tools worth claiming, no possessions that suggested he had ever been anything more than another casualty of poverty in Victorian London. The parish buried him in a common grave, and within days even the residents of his building could not recall his name or face, for he had been invisible in life and remained invisible in death. The sewers continued to carry waste downstream, the rats continued to breed in whatever spaces remained available, and London continued its relentless expansion, consuming land and labour and lives in its transformation from medieval city to modern metropolis. The men who had hunted rats through darkness were forgotten, their trade erased from history except in scattered references in old newspapers and in the memories of a few elderly people who had witnessed that world before it vanished. The shadow had faded, leaving only the faint outline of where it had once fallen, barely visible, soon to be obliterated entirely by the advancing light of a new century that would have no place for such primitive and brutal professions. The candle had burned low, the chamber had fallen silent, and history once again had turned the page in the dark. Good night, dear listener. The story of Victorian London's rat catchers has drawn to its close, as all stories must. Whatever hour finds you now, whatever corner of the world receives this tale, know that you have walked with me through shadows that few remember, through lives that history chose to forget. The night is quiet once more, the past has released its hold, and perhaps, if sleep has found you somewhere in these chapters, then the old trade has served one final purpose, granting rest to the weary as it once granted employment to the desperate. Until we meet again in another darkened corridor of history, I bid you peaceful dreams. Thank you for listening to the Bedside Historian.